As majority owner, I'll be taking this company in a new direction. My husband's voice rang out across the boardroom, confident and clear. He stood at the head of the table, smiling like he'd just won something. Heat rushed to my face. Shock collided with rage, both fighting for control of my voice. Around the table, 12 board members shifted in their seats. Some looked confused. Others looked at me, waiting for my reaction. I sat frozen, hands gripping the armrests of my chair. This was my company. The one I'd built from nothing. The one I'd poured 5 years of my life into while he played golf and networked at clubs I'd paid for. And now he was standing there claiming it was his. My name is Eliza Monroe, and this was the moment my husband tried to erase me in public. The words hung in the air like poison. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare at him. This man I'd married, this man I'd trusted, as he smiled at the board like he'd just delivered good news. Then something worse happened. Applause broke out. Slow at first, then louder. Not everyone clapped, but enough did. Enough to make my stomach turn. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. People gathered their laptops and notepads, avoiding my eyes as they filed out. Conversations died whenever I came near. It was like I'd become invisible in my own boardroom. My husband, Cameron, stayed behind, straightening his tie, organizing his papers with casual precision. He looked satisfied. Proud even. I stood by the window staring at the city skyline below, trying to steady my breathing. Trying not to scream. Cameron walked over and squeezed my arm gently. His touch felt rehearsed, like everything else about this moment. "Don't make this ugly," he whispered, his voice low and warm, as if he were comforting me instead of betraying me. I pulled my arm away, finally meeting his eyes. "What did you just do?" He smiled, that same charming smile that had once made me feel safe. "I did what needed to be done. You'll understand eventually." Then he walked out, leaving me alone in the empty boardroom. I stood there for a long time, replaying the announcement in my mind. The way he'd stood. The way he'd spoken. The confidence in his voice. This wasn't spontaneous. This was rehearsed. Planned. Calculated. He'd been preparing for this moment, and I hadn't seen it coming. I thought back to the first time Cameron had asked to be listed for optics. It was 3 years ago, shortly after we got married. The company was growing fast, attracting investors, and Cameron suggested it would look better if the leadership team showed a partnership. "It's just for appearances," he'd said, leaning against the kitchen counter, coffee in hand. "Investors like seeing a united front. It shows stability." I'd hesitated. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't explain why. Cameron had been supportive, attending events, making introductions, helping me network. It seemed reasonable to acknowledge his contributions publicly. So I agreed. Out of love. Out of trust. We drafted paperwork listing him as a co-founder in promotional materials. It was supposed to be symbolic, nothing more. Just optics, like he said. But there was one document I never countersigned. A shareholder agreement Cameron had pushed for, claiming it was standard legal protection. My lawyer had flagged it, saying the language was vague and potentially problematic. I'd set it aside, meaning to review it later. But life got busy. Funding rounds. Product launches. Hiring sprees. I forgot about it. Now, standing in that empty boardroom, I wondered if that unsigned document was the key to everything. I founded Technova 5 years ago, fresh out of graduate school with nothing but an idea and a maxed-out credit card. The company started in my apartment. Just me, a laptop, and endless nights fueled by coffee and determination. I was the public face. The one pitching to investors. The one handling product development, marketing strategy, and crisis management. I built the culture, hired every employee, and made every major decision. Cameron came into my life 2 years later. We met at a tech conference where I was speaking. He was charming, confident, and supportive in ways I desperately needed. Running a startup was lonely. He made it feel less so. We got married 6 months after we started dating. Looking back, it was fast. Too fast. But I was exhausted and overwhelmed, and Cameron felt like stability. He offered to help with the company. Not operationally, he didn't have the background, but with connections. Networking. Investor relations. I welcomed it. I needed the help. But somewhere along the way I made a mistake. I trusted marriage more than paperwork. I believed love meant partnership, and partnership meant sharing credit. Now I was paying for that belief. The shares were never what they seemed. Cameron's involvement grew slowly, almost invisibly. At first he just attended events with me, conferences, investor dinners, product launches. People assumed he was involved because he was always there, smiling beside me. Then he started sitting in on meetings. Just to observe, he'd say. I want to understand your world better. Investors began addressing questions to both of us as if we were a team. Cameron never corrected them. Neither did I. It felt harmless. He inserted himself into strategy discussions, offering opinions on hiring, expansion, and partnerships. His suggestions were often good. He had a talent for reading people and situations. I started valuing his input. Somewhere along the way, decisions I used to make alone became decisions we made together. Or at least that's how it looked from the outside. Inside, I was still running everything. But the optics had shifted. Then about 6 months ago, something changed. Investors started calling Cameron directly. Not me. Him. The first time it happened, I laughed it off. They probably just got confused, I told myself. But it kept happening. Emails addressed to him. Meeting requests sent to his calendar instead of mine. I mentioned it once, casually over dinner. Cameron shrugged. They probably think I'm more accessible. Don't worry about it. I should have worried. The narrative shift happened so gradually I almost didn't notice it. Cameron started referring to himself as co-creator in conversations. Not in front of me, but in public settings where I wasn't present. I first heard it on a podcast he did without telling me. I was driving home from a meeting when his voice came through my car speakers. The host asked him about Teknova's origin story. We built it together, Cameron said smoothly. It started as Eliza's idea, but I came in early to help shape the vision and strategy. It's been a partnership from the beginning. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. That wasn't true. He hadn't been there from the beginning. He'd shown up 2 years in after the hard work was done. But I didn't correct it. I told myself it didn't matter. That public perception wasn't the same as reality. That I knew the truth and that was enough. I was wrong. Public perception was everything. Over the next few months, Cameron repeated the co-creator narrative in interviews, at networking events, and in casual conversations with investors. Each time the story grew a little bolder. And each time I stayed silent. I thought I was being gracious, supportive, a good partner. I was actually losing my company. 6 weeks before the boardroom announcement, a board member named Harold pulled me aside after a meeting. He was one of the early investors, someone I trusted. Eliza, he said quietly, glancing around to make sure we were alone. Are you comfortable with how this looks? I frowned. How what looks? Harold hesitated, choosing his words carefully. The way Cameron's been positioning himself. Some of the newer investors think he's the primary founder. I just want to make sure you're okay with that. My stomach tightened, but I forced a smile. It's fine. Cameron's been incredibly helpful. I don't mind sharing credit. Harold studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. Just wanted to check. He walked away, leaving me standing alone in the hallway. That conversation haunted me for days. It was the first time someone had openly questioned Cameron's role. The first time I'd been forced to defend something that shouldn't have needed defending. That night, I went home and pulled out the old files from Teknova's early days. Incorporation documents. Shareholder agreements. Investor term sheets. I stayed up until 3 a.m, reading every page, checking every clause. And I started preparing something. Quietly. Carefully. Just in case. At home, Cameron became colder. Conversations that used to flow easily now felt transactional. He stopped asking about my day. Stopped listening when I talked about work challenges. He talked about me like I was already gone. When I restructure the leadership team, he'd say casually over breakfast, as if it were a foregone conclusion. Once I bring in the new investors, he'd mention during dinner, not we, I. I noticed other things too. He spent more time on his phone texting people I didn't know. He took calls in other rooms, speaking in low voices I couldn't hear. One evening, about 2 weeks before the boardroom announcement, Cameron mentioned a shareholder vote. There's a board meeting coming up, he said, not looking up from his laptop. We'll be discussing some structural changes. Ownership clarity. That sort of thing. My pulse quickened. What kind of structural changes? He waved a hand dismissively. Just formalizing what's already understood. Don't worry about it. But I did worry. Because ownership clarity could mean anything. And Cameron's tone suggested it meant something very specific. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to Cameron's steady breathing beside me. He was planning something. I could feel it. 3 days before the boardroom meeting, Cameron made his move. He sent an internal memo to the board claiming formal majority ownership of Teknova. I didn't receive the memo directly. I heard about it secondhand from Harold, who called me late in the evening, his voice tight with concern. "Eliza, we need to talk. Cameron just sent something to the board. He's claiming he owns 51% of the company." My blood ran cold. "What?" Harold explained. Cameron had referenced the shareholder agreement I'd never signed, claiming it had been executed and filed. He'd argued that his contributions, financial, strategic, and operational, entitled him to majority control. It was a lie. But it was a convincing lie, backed by documents I couldn't immediately disprove. "What are you going to do?" Harold asked. I didn't answer right away. My mind was racing, piecing together months of manipulation and positioning. Cameron hadn't just taken credit. He'd been building a case for ownership. "I'll handle it," I said finally. After I hung up, I went to my office and pulled out the old files I'd reviewed weeks earlier. The company's original formation documents. The shareholder agreements. The bylaws I'd drafted with my first lawyer. I spread everything across my desk and started reading again, looking for something. Anything. And then I found it. It was buried in the company's original formation language. A clause I'd insisted on 5 years ago when I first incorporated. At the time, it had seemed like standard protective language. Nothing special. The clause stated that any public claim of majority ownership by a non-founding shareholder would trigger an automatic review and potential redistribution of shares based on documented contributions and legal filings. It was designed to protect me from hostile takeovers or investor overreach. I drafted it with my lawyer during Teknova's earliest days, when I was terrified of losing control. I'd forgotten about it completely. But the clause was still there, embedded in the corporate structure. And it had a specific trigger, a public declaration of ownership. If someone claimed majority control publicly, in a board meeting, in a filing, or in any official capacity, the clause activated automatically. It required immediate documentation review, and if the claim couldn't be substantiated with proper legal filings, the shares reverted to their original distribution. Cameron had just made a public claim in the boardroom. He'd activated the clause himself. And he had no idea what he'd done. I said nothing publicly. Not to the board. Not to Cameron. Not to anyone. Cameron interpreted my silence as surrender. I could see it in the way he carried himself. More confident, more authoritative. He started making decisions without consulting me, sending emails on behalf of the company, scheduling meetings with investors. He thought he'd won. Meanwhile, I worked quietly in my office documenting everything. 5 years of records. Incorporation filings. Investor agreements. Email trails showing who had made which decisions. I compiled it all into a single comprehensive file. Then I waited. Press inquiries started coming in about a week after the boardroom meeting. Tech journalists had heard rumors about leadership changes at Teknova. They wanted comments. Clarification. Cameron handled most of the inquiries himself, giving carefully worded statements about transitional leadership and strategic realignment. Each statement dug him deeper. Each public claim reinforced the clause activation. And with every passing day, I gathered more evidence. Cameron gave 3 interviews over the next 2 weeks. In each one, he positioned himself as Teknova's driving force. He talked about his vision for the company. He discussed his strategy for the next funding round. The tech press ate it up. Headlines started appearing: Cameron Monroe takes the helm at Teknova, and new leadership at rising tech firm. I watched from home, laptop open, taking notes. Investors started asking questions, but not the ones Cameron expected. They wanted documentation, legal filings, proof of ownership claims. Cameron grew frustrated. He called emergency board meetings to discuss internal alignment. He demanded that I publicly support his leadership. I declined to attend most of these meetings, citing scheduling conflicts. Harold called me after each one. "Eliza, what are you doing? The board is confused. Cameron's pushing hard. You need to say something." Not yet, I replied calmly. When? Soon. I could hear Harold's frustration, but he trusted me. He'd been there from the beginning. He knew who'd built this company. 2 weeks after the initial boardroom announcement, Cameron cornered me at home. His confidence had cracked, replaced by something sharper. Desperation. You need to back my claim publicly, he demanded. The investors are asking questions. The board wants clarity. You need to release a statement supporting my ownership. I looked up from my laptop, meeting his eyes calmly. Not yet. His jaw tightened. What do you mean, not yet? This is important, Eliza. Our reputation depends on it. Your reputation, I corrected softly. Cameron's face flushed. Don't play games with me. I've worked too hard for this. Worked hard. I repeated, my voice still calm. Tell me, Cameron. What exactly have you built? He stared at me, speechless. I returned to my laptop. I'll make a statement when I'm ready. Cameron left the room, slamming the door behind him. That night I finalized my draft. It was precise, factual, and unemotional. No accusations. No insults. Just a clear explanation of Teknova's ownership structure and the legal mechanisms triggered by public claims. I scheduled its release for the following Monday. The deadline was approaching and Cameron had no idea what was coming. I spent the weekend perfecting the statement. Every word mattered. Every sentence needed to be airtight. The statement explained Teknova's original formation, the protective clause I'd included, and the automatic review process triggered by Cameron's public ownership claim. It detailed his actual contributions, networking and investor introductions, and clarified that he held no legal shares in the company. It was devastating in its simplicity. I didn't accuse Cameron of lying. I didn't call him manipulative or deceptive. I simply stated facts, backed by legal documents and corporate filings. The statement concluded with a single paragraph. Teknova remains wholly owned by its founder, Eliza Monroe. All shares are accounted for and legally documented. No change in ownership has occurred or will occur based on undocumented claims. I read it 20 times, checking for errors, for emotional language, for anything that could be twisted or misinterpreted. It was perfect. On Sunday evening, I scheduled the statement to go live Monday morning at 9. It would be sent to the board, to investors, to the press, and posted on Teknova's official channels simultaneously. Cameron had no idea it was coming. Monday morning, Cameron woke up energized. He had a meeting scheduled with potential investors, people he'd been courting for weeks, promising them access to his company. Over breakfast, he mentioned the meeting casually. I'm finalizing the Series B today. Should be a good day. I sipped my coffee, saying nothing. Cameron studied me for a moment. You're being too quiet lately. It's making people nervous. People? I asked. Or you? His eyes narrowed. I'm serious, Eliza. If you speak out against me, I'll destroy your reputation. I have connections. Investors trust me. If you try to undermine this, you'll look vindictive and unstable. I set down my coffee cup, meeting his gaze steadily. Is that a threat? It's a warning. He stood, straightening his jacket. I'm trying to protect both of us. Don't make me choose. He left for his meeting. At 9 o'clock, my statement went live. The statement appeared everywhere at once. Board members received it via email. Investors saw it in their morning briefings. Tech journalists picked it up within minutes. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was simply factual. And it was devastating. Within the first hour, shares began shifting automatically. The protective clause I'd embedded in Teknova's original formation activated, triggering an immediate audit of ownership claims. Cameron's claim, unsupported by legal documentation, was voided. My ownership, backed by 5 years of incorporation records, shareholder agreements and corporate filings, was confirmed and solidified. The shift happened automatically, built into the company's legal structure. No vote was needed. No board approval was required. Cameron's public claims had triggered the very mechanism designed to protect me from exactly this situation. I sat in my office watching the responses roll in. Board members expressing support. Investors requesting emergency calls. Press outlets updating their stories. And then my phone rang. It was Cameron. What did you do? Cameron's voice was high-pitched, frantic. What the hell did you do, Eliza? I could hear noise in the background, voices, movement. He was still at the investor meeting. I released a statement, I said calmly. Clarifying ownership. You can't do this. You can't just, this isn't over. I have rights. I have. You have nothing, I interrupted, my voice still calm. You never had shares, Cameron. You never owned anything. You just convinced yourself you did. Silence. Then, the investors are asking questions. They want to see documentation. They're pulling out of the meeting. I know. You planned this, he whispered, realization dawning. You've been planning this the whole time. No, I corrected. I built protections into my company 5 years ago. You activated them yourself when you made a public claim you couldn't support. I could hear his breathing, ragged and panicked. The clause triggered automatically, I continued. All shares reverted to their documented owners. Which is me. Only me. Cameron made a strangled sound, half rage, half desperation. You destroyed me, he said finally. No, I replied. You destroyed yourself. I hung up. By noon, board members were distancing themselves from Cameron. Emails went out clarifying that his statements had been unauthorized and not reflective of company policy. Cameron was suddenly non-essential. Meetings he'd scheduled were canceled. Investor calls he'd arranged were redirected to me. His access to company systems was quietly revoked. It happened so fast. One moment he'd been positioning himself as the leader. The next he was irrelevant. Harold called me that afternoon. Eliza, the board wants you to step back in. Full operational control. We need leadership, and it's clear now who that should be. I never stepped away, I reminded him. I know. But we're making it official. Emergency board vote tonight. Unanimous support. That evening, the board formally reinstated me as sole CEO and majority owner. Not that I'd ever lost those positions, but the public affirmation mattered. Cameron wasn't invited to the meeting. It felt over. Finally over. But I should have known better. Cameron tried one last move. He couldn't fight the legal structure. The documentation was too solid, the clause too clear. But he could try to spin the narrative publicly. 2 days after my statement went live, Cameron posted on social media. He framed himself as a betrayed partner who'd been pushed out after years of dedication. He claimed I'd used legal technicalities to erase his contributions. The post was carefully worded to avoid outright lies, but it painted a picture of victimhood. Of a supportive husband betrayed by an ambitious wife. Got traction at first. People who didn't know the full story sympathized with him. Comments flooded in expressing support, calling me cold and calculating. But then something unexpected happened. Employees started speaking up. People who'd been there from the beginning. People who'd watched Cameron insert himself into a company he hadn't built. They shared their own stories. Emails showing his minimal involvement. Meeting notes proving his late arrival to the company. Testimonies about who'd actually made the key decisions. The narrative flipped within hours. Cameron's spin backfired spectacularly. The more people looked into the facts, the clearer the truth became. Tech journalists pulled old articles showing Technova's founding timeline. Investors confirmed the ownership structure had never changed. My statement, dry, factual, unemotional, became the reference point everyone cited. It was airtight. There was nothing to dispute. Cameron's post was taken down quietly a day later. No explanation. No apology. Just gone. The press moved on, but the verdict remained. Silence became its own confirmation. 3 days after his failed spin attempt, Cameron resigned from all advisory positions at Technova. The resignation letter was brief and professional, claiming he was pursuing other opportunities. No one believed it, but no one challenged it either. It was over. The marriage ended quietly. No screaming. No dramatic confrontations. Just 2 lawyers and a stack of paperwork. Cameron moved out while I was at the office. I came home to empty closets and missing furniture. He'd taken what was his and left everything else untouched. There was no final conversation. No closure. Just an empty house and divorce papers waiting for my signature. I signed them without hesitation. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later. Cameron walked away with nothing from Technova. The prenup we'd signed protected the company completely. He got his personal assets, his car, and half of our shared savings. Everything else stayed with me. The morning after the divorce was finalized, I walked into the Teknova office alone. No Cameron beside me. No pretense of partnership. Just me the way it had always really been. I restructured leadership immediately. Transparency became the foundation. I promoted people based on merit and documented contributions. I clarified roles and responsibilities, ensuring no one could claim credit they hadn't earned. The company stabilized within weeks. Employees who'd been confused or anxious about leadership now had clarity. Investors who'd been uncertain now had confidence. Teknova's stock price actually rose following the ownership clarification. Turns out, investors preferred clean structures over ambiguous partnerships. We launched 2 new products that quarter. Both successful. Revenue increased. Team morale improved. The company I'd built 5 years ago was thriving again, free from manipulation and false claims. Media coverage began shifting too. Articles that had once focused on leadership drama now highlighted Teknova's growth and innovation. My name appeared in headlines again. Eliza Monroe steers Teknova through transition, and founder reclaims vision after ownership dispute. The narrative had finally corrected itself. 6 months after the boardroom announcement, my reputation had completely flipped. What Cameron had tried to frame as vindictive and calculating was now seen as decisive leadership and integrity. I was invited to speak at conferences about founder protection and corporate governance. Other entrepreneurs, especially women, reached out for advice on protecting their companies from similar situations. I became known for restraint and strategic thinking. For handling a difficult situation without drama or public spectacle. Cameron, meanwhile, faded from relevance. He tried launching his own venture, but investors were wary. His reputation preceded him. People remembered the Teknova situation and they kept their distance. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to another city, trying to rebuild in a market where fewer people knew his name. I felt nothing when I heard that. No satisfaction. No sympathy. Just neutral acceptance that his choices had consequences. One evening, sitting alone in my office after everyone had gone home, I reflected on what I'd lost and what I'd gained. I'd lost a marriage. Trust. Years of my life spent with someone who'd only wanted what I'd built. But I'd gained something more valuable. Certainty. Clarity. The knowledge that I could protect what was mine. Teknova continued growing. We secured Series B funding at a valuation that exceeded all projections. We expanded into new markets. We hired talented people who believed in the mission. I thrived personally too. Without Cameron's constant presence, I rediscovered parts of myself I'd suppressed. I took up painting again, joined a book club, made friends outside the tech world. The company grew stronger without manipulation. Decisions were made based on strategy and data, not on ego or hidden agendas. My leadership team respected me, not because I was married to someone well-connected, but because I'd built something worth believing in. 1 year after the boardroom announcement, Teknova was featured in a major business magazine. The article detailed the company's growth, innovative products, and strong leadership. There was one line about the ownership dispute from a year earlier, but it was brief and factual. The focus was on what I'd built, not what I'd overcome. That's when I knew I'd truly moved past it. The story was no longer about Cameron's betrayal. It was about Teknova's success. And that success was entirely mine. 2 years later, I stood in the same boardroom where Cameron had made his announcement. But this time the room was filled with people I'd chosen. People I trusted. People who'd earned their seats. We were discussing expansion plans, opening offices in 3 new cities, launching a 4th product line, and preparing for eventual IPO. It was everything I'd dreamed of when I first started Teknova. Everything I'd worked toward for 7 years. And it was entirely, undeniably mine. After the meeting ended, I stood alone by the window looking out at the city. I thought about that day 2 years ago. The rage. The feeling of being erased in public. Cameron had thought claiming my work would make him powerful. He'd believed that positioning himself as the leader would somehow make it true. But all he'd done was activate the protections I'd built into my company from the very beginning. All he'd done was prove that public claims without substance eventually crumble. All he'd done was remind everyone who'd actually built Teknova. I smiled, turning away from the window. The past was behind me. The future stretched ahead, full of possibility. Cameron had tried to take everything. Instead he'd lost it all. And I'd kept building.